Okay, welcome everybody. Here are some things I've learned from the Greek of Romans chapter 2. This goes with my recording on a separate video of Romans chapter 2 read aloud in Greek. So the first word I'm going to look at is this anapologetos. So the an means not, or in this case without. And so anapologetos means without excuse or without defense. You have no defense. It's really a legal term. Apologetics is the word used by Christians today when they talk about defending and promoting their faith. But I say the term is unfortunate because in modern English, an apology, and this word in modern English comes from this Greek word, but it's changed its meaning slightly, and in modern English it means saying sorry for something wrong you've done. So that's not quite what we mean by apologetics. I like listening to Christians like Peter Hitchens, who I call the unapologetic apologist. He's on the front foot all the time, not just apologizing. Next point, here we notice chiasmus again, as I pointed out in chapter 1. So verb, object, and then object, verb. A, B, B, A pattern. Here the use of the chiasmus highlights the hypocrisy. You judge the other person, yourself you condemn in doing so. Okay, so krima is the noun, and coming down here, now krisia, here. And there is also a noun krisis, not found in Romans. It's a general rule that nouns formed with a ma ending, like krima, express a resulting state, while other endings like sis express the action. This may be the case here, but we have to remember that New Testament Greek is an ordinary language used by ordinary people, and it isn't always technically precise. Modern legal and scientific documents try to be precise, but ordinary people can't read them. Okay, next comment coming down to verse 9 and 10. In verse 10, he uses the verb in a participle form, while in verse 9, it had the kata prefix, the aleph or alpha or a drops off when it goes with this vowel e epsilon here. And we're told in the grammar books that the kata prefix intensifies the meaning, but here I think it's just stylistic variation. In verse 1 it looks like intensifying. Verse 1 said in Hogar krines ton heteron seauton kata krines, you condemn yourself. In verse 13 we have the two different words dikaioi and dikaiathesontai. And because they are two slightly different words, we see that the NIV has used slightly different translations for them, righteous and declared righteous. But again here, I think that the use of the different words is purely stylistic, and it's confusing to an English reader who might think that a difference in meaning is intended. But that I'm pretty sure there's not a difference in meaning intended, because what it's saying is that if you want to be, well, it's expressed very well by the Good News Bible translation here, which only says it the once, which I think makes good, clear English style. It's not by hearing the law that people are put right with God, but by doing what the law commands. So in that way, the contrast, which is always an important thing in English, and is indicated by the intonation. It's not by hearing, but by doing. That comes out more clearly, and we're not distracted or put off the scent, if you like, by the difference in words here, because what it's meaning to say is entirely the same outcome is being talked about, but the important thing that's changing is the hearing and the doing. Verse 14, I've just underlined this. Now this in the old King James Bible said, a law unto themselves, and so that's become an expression in English, but again it's changed its meaning. If you're a law, if we say he's a law unto himself, it means he does whatever he wants to, usually bad things. But here the meaning is slightly different. It's saying that they more or less that they supply the law from their own inward understanding, their own inward conscience. So this word conscience is interesting because the Greek word could mean conscience or consciousness, awareness. The Greek word sunedesios was translated part by part into Latin as conscientia, which was then borrowed into English and made into two different forms to make a meaning distinction, which can be made in English, not in ancient Greek nor in Latin, but we've distinguished these two different forms because in our modern Western ethical view, conscience is quite a big thing. So we separated out a word meaning conscious from a word that had a broader meaning in both Greek and Latin. So note here, this passage contains a lot of legal terminology. I've attempted a translation of this little section. Particularly here, their thoughts are witnesses for the prosecution sometimes, and sometimes two witnesses for the defense. So it's a court scene that I think Paul has in mind. Verse 21, chiasmus again, very similar to what we had in verse 1. Teaching the other. Yourself, you do not teach. Now here in verse 25 and 26, note the two different meanings of the word akrobustia. In verse 26, it's being uncircumcised physically, but in verse 25, it's being uncircumcised spiritually. So it's talking about a Jew in verse 25, a Jew who is circumcised physically, but he's uncircumcised in the real, deeper sense, what the Old Testament itself calls circumcision of the heart. But the interesting thing that I want to draw attention to is that the word slips from the one meaning to the other unannounced. Bible writers love to throw in different meanings of words to make you think. This is quite different to modern scientific language, where terms are carefully defined at the start and the defined meaning is strictly adhered to. But the Bible style is different, and I think the whole point is to make you think. And Judaios has two meanings in these verses, just like akrobustia. In verse 28, we are talking about a Jew who is a Jew by physical descent. And in verse 29, we meet the true Jew. And the same thing applies to peritome, circumcision. I note also in those last two verses, 28 and 29, there is only one estin. In English, we need several more is. In English, the is, or its other forms, are, am, were, was, has to be there. If that's what you mean, it has to be there in English. You can't say, for example, John tall. You have to say John is tall. But in Bible language, as in several other languages that I know of, it's optional. Anyway, this leads us to a first approximation grammar rule. Those of you who have seen my other videos will have heard how I use the word first approximation translation of Greek and Hebrew words. And I say that that's the first approximation, but in any given context you might need to think about other possible meanings. So here we have a first approximation grammar rule. If the is there, it's giving emphasis. And this looks to be the case, for example, in verse 2 and verse 11. You can look back at those. But this rule doesn't always hold true, as I think we see here in verses 28 and 29. So anyway, now just to look at how the NIV has translated those verses. And they've put in, interestingly, they've put in 7 is. There it is. You can count them, and that's why that makes it clear in English. And that's why trying to read the Greek with its single estin is hard for a person whose native language is English. Okay, so just to conclude, would you like to be a real Jew? Join me.